Most of the week, please take your seat. Most of the week has been focused on technology, but I thought it was very important to broaden the scope. We know the role of climate change in generating conflict, and we know the role of technology in actually managing the low carbon transition. And so I thought a fireside chat where we would discuss those issues would be essential, all the more so as this is an area that is very much in focus for the CAN program, which is the interaction between civil society, business, and government. And to do that, I'm very pleased that we have two exceptional speakers. Fred Krupp has been the leader for 3 decades of the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a global civil society organization that works with business, that works with government throughout the world to push for smart policies to manage climate change. And Mark Gallogly, next to me, is an investor who has spent a lot of time also looking at how investment, because the low carbon transition is not something that comes without some serious investment. And so he is an investor who has focused a lot of his energy, I mean, if I may say energy, talking about climate, a lot of his efforts in helping that climate transition. And I must add something, he is the vice chair of the Columbia Board of Trustees, and so we are particularly honored to have you today with us. And they both know. Oh, yeah. So we're really delighted to have these two gentlemen with us today, and I will just listen as you will, because they know much more about climate change, transformation toward a low carbon economy than I do. Over to you.
So as an environmentalist, environmentalists are seldom accused of being shy. So I will start and just ask you, Mark, as Jean-Marie just mentioned, you have spent decades investing, been extraordinarily successful at it, and now you've decided to devote yourself to environmental issues, climate issues. Why? What inspired you to do that?
First of all, it's great to be here. I think Fred and I were talking just before this. We've known each other for a long time. We have a lot to learn from this group. We're trying to figure out how to influence climate to the positive around the world, particularly globally, and in my case, particularly in emerging markets. We really need some advice. So our hope is that this conversation, we'll talk about what we're doing, and then we really want to hear from you specific things that we should be thinking about that we're not. And if that happens in this conversation, great. If it happens as part of the Kent Global Leadership Program, send it down, send it to us. We'd be really interested in that. I am a retired investor. Okay, I retired 3 years ago. I ran private equity at Blackstone for many years. I started a business called Centerbridge, which has grown a lot. I retired from Centerbridge 3 years ago to focus just on climate. And my wife, Lise, is on EDF's board, and Lise has been a lifelong environmentalist. And so her thinking, she's really been my guiding light around this. And then Columbia, which is my second great love, is also a guiding interest, because Columbia has 1,000 people throughout this entire 18 different schools working on climate. 1,000 people working on climate. When you really look at it, Lamont Doherty, you may or may not be familiar with, but there's a 45-acre campus up on the Hudson River that's just climate focused, okay, and just research focused. 200 postdocs at Lamont Doherty just on climate. I could talk more about the different pieces, of that. We started a climate school at Columbia. Stanford has a climate school. Anyway, the bottom line is you're at a good place if you're interested in climate. There are a lot of people here who dedicate their lives to trying to think about where are we, both on policy here at SIPA and on technology, on engineering, and on all aspects of it. Okay, so what am I, I'm not sure if I answered that question.
Why you did it? You gave credit to Lise, which I love
Yeah.
that. And so you decide to go into climate. And so you decide to go into climate, and you could do that in a lot of different ways. For years, Lise and Mark have been supporting the Environmental Defense Fund. So you are a philanthropist, and you could have decided that's how you were going to do it. But you made a different decision. You made a decision that you're going to keep doing that. Thank you. But in addition to that, you decided you were going to spend, as Jean-Marie said, your energy, your personal time. And you actually not only decided to spend your personal time, but you've created 3 new organizations, the Allied Climate Partners, Allied Talent Partners, and the Global Carbon Markets Utility.
Great names, don't you think those are really catchy?
But what inspired, that's got to be unique. Someone makes this transition from investing to climate and then founds 3 different organizations. How did you land on that, and what was the need that you were responding to?
So I retired 3 years ago. I went to work for John Kerry for about 7 months at the State Department to build a finance team for Secretary Kerry. If you're a Secretary of State, you're used to having the whole building respond to you quickly. And if you're special envoy, you have a team. That team had to know something about climate finance. The State Department knows a lot about a lot of things, but not as much about finance as they do other things. So they're very dependent upon the Treasury Department or the White House. And John wanted to have a small team that really understood finance. And so he built that team, and I helped him a little bit building that team. I left after a short period of time, not because I didn't love diplomacy, but because I felt like finance was more my strength. To the extent I had an area of competitive disadvantage in the world, it was climate, and a competitive advantage, it was around finance. So we're trying to figure out what can we do to identify specific parts of the financial / climate world where there's something that doesn't work. And the 3 that we landed on, although there are many, are money, talent, markets, money, talent, markets. And specifically, while Lise and I both do a lot of things in the United States around climate, Fred's a super leader in this. The bigger need capital-wise was in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Central America, and parts of Latin America. And so the emerging markets, broadly speaking. Each of those is very different places, obviously, and I know you know more about it than I do. But anyway, they're really different. We formed funds in Southeast Asia, $175 million in Southeast Asia for early stage projects in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia. We've announced a fund for Africa, $250 million. In each case, we're backing a local GP. We take no fees, no carry, no anything. We just want this other GP to do more. And today we have a small team. The we in all of this is 3 Cairns. That's the name of the firm that Lisa and I started. We have about 35 people at 3 Cairns, and we have lots of projects, but 3 of the bigger projects are around the 3 issues I've just mentioned: talent, money, markets. Briefly, and then I'll flip it over to Fred. In the talent world, our focus is, let me say it one more time. These 3 things, first they're ideas, then you try to develop the idea. If it's a good idea, scale the idea. That's the trajectory of this. So we're sort of between development and scale around the money side, meaning we have a fund in Southeast Asia. We've raised it. I'll describe how later in this conversation. We've identified the manager in Africa and announced it. We've identified the manager for the Caribbean. We haven't yet announced that because we want to make sure we made a good decision. And we've met with many managers in India. Eric Garcetti, who I met with a couple weeks ago in India, he's been quite thoughtful about this and connecting us to other parties in India. Anyway, the point of all this is that we're trying on the money side to figure out what is the blockage around climate. There's a lot of problems, but one of them is, and just think about this: if you buy a house in the United States, you used to put down 20% down payment, right? That down payment is your risk. Somebody lends you 80 cents, 80%. In climate finance in the developing world, it's similar. Who's going to come up with the earliest stage money? So if you have a project in New York City and you need $5 million, there are a lot of people to go to who have $5 million to invest in a project in the US that might be a $200 million project. That $5 million might be to buy the land or get the permit or do the engineering, or you can give a quick list. That is the riskiest dollars, the first $5 million or $10 million to a large scale project. If you're in India, there's decent capital markets. If you're in Vietnam, it's tricky because of the government and other things. If you're in Nigeria, it's really hard to find $5 or $10 million. And often what you end up doing if you're an entrepreneur is going to the government or going to the African Development Bank or the USAID or any other organization. Those people don't like really early stage risk either. They don't like it. It's too risky. The IFC, the World Bank, I love the World Bank, but they don't like it. It's too risky. They're a lender. They're not an equity provider in general. Okay, so these funds are meant to provide that capital. More briefly on talent, today we just focus on Africa and talent today because that project is still earlier stage than the one I just mentioned. In that project, we have 5 people that we've hired on the continent. 1 person in the United States works with them. So the team will be African focused, African individuals. And if you had a project anywhere in Africa today, that's a climate related project, it could be water, EV charging stations, solar, C&I solar, you name it. Okay, we have a broad definition. And you said to us, it's called Allied Talent Partners. It has its own website and all that good stuff. If you said, I'm looking for a blank, someone who understands permitting, an engineer, a chief financial officer, not a permanent person, not someone who's going to just work for you, but to work for 3 or 6 months to do XYZ, some specific project, then we'll go find that person for you. And we'll vet the person, work with you on the scoping of what does the person do. We'll hire the person. You have to pay for the person. Malawi right now, we have 2 people working for the government of Malawi that's free. But we don't want free because it's hard to support things that are free. And people don't often value free. So we're looking to have someone pay for this, okay, and run it as a break-even business. Right now, it's a money loser business, so it's philanthropic, but we hope it can eventually be break-even. Today, we only have 12 people working in Africa, okay, 12 different, but we've vetted 500, and ultimately, we hope to vet thousands. This business model that I'm describing exists all over the world. There are 20 companies in the OECD market that do this. It's essentially sophisticated gig work. And there are many, many people who want to work on a project basis. They don't want to work full-time in an office. They want to work for 4 months on something, accomplish it, and move on. Or take 2 months off and go skiing, and then work again. And that's what we're trying to do. And then the last one is carbon markets, but I don't want to talk any more about it. We can come back to that if you're interested. Let's flip to you.
No. See, I have a couple more questions, Mark, before we do that. One is, what about what you've done so far since you made the transition gives you and should give these diplomats hope? Because climate change, when you hear it, it just sounds so big and overwhelming. And yet, you get up in the morning and you're going with a lot of positivity. Let me just ask you.
Yeah, I mean, this is true for all of your lives. I'm sure there are things you run into. So what drives you? It's not that different for anybody else, A friend of mine always tells me, be the happy warrior. Don't be the unhappy warrior. Not cool. So that's the strategy, is to be positive about this. Climate change is coming at us with ferocity. ferocity. It's hard to overstate how disruptive this will be to every aspect of society. I'm a firm believer that we're misstating how big this problem is. We're way understating the problem. We're way understating the amount of money it's going to cost us and civil disruption it will result in. And that cost is being misunderstood by private sector actors, right? They're going to spend a lot more goddamn money going forward. I swear a lot, so I won't do that anymore. But they're going to spend a lot more money. Last month in Nature, Johan Rockström and the team at Potsdam Institute said, we'll spend about 6x the cost if we spent the money now versus waiting in a 2-degree world, which we could talk about whether that's going to be our future. We will spend 6 times more money. Okay, and I think that understates it. Capitalism depends upon supply chains working, people not moving in mass migration. It depends on civil society working, rule of law working, countries' borders being secure. Okay, all of these things are, they're challenged. They're challenged today. They're about to be mega challenged. And it's not in the long term. It's in the near term that they will be challenged.
Yeah, that study I saw too, it said $39 trillion in costs to the GDP, about 19% of the GDP. It would cost 6 times more to the world not to solve it than the amount of money we would need to actually make the transition to a 2-degree world. It's remarkable. And I think, if I remember, that didn't even account for the extra costs, not in the model yet, from increasing ferocious storms or wildfires. So as you said, it understates it. And so is it that, Mark, my last question, is it that the fact that we're understating the costs and the damages that brings us back to conflict and conflict resolution?
You all know more about a lot of things than I would know about, including conflict and conflict resolution. But I thought the Times yesterday, or it was either the Times or the Post, had an article around on the front page around the Europeans. I know there are Europeans here. You'd know more about this too. Moving migrants with the I'll use the word cooperation of African governments into desert areas in the north of Africa, okay? Because, and obviously the UK is doing what it's doing with Kagame, right? So is that going to happen more? It's off the chart more, okay? There are 1.4 billion Africans, there are going to be 2.8 billion Africans. The world's going to get hotter under all circumstances. It's not, there's no question about it. There's 600 million Africans who don't have electricity. That is not slowing down. There were 600 million 10 years ago. How come? Why were there 600 million 10 years ago? Because they increased economic vitality to 300 million, but they grew their population 300 million, so it's still 600 million. This is like, when it gets super, super hot and you have no electricity, what are you going to do? You're walking to Europe, okay? You are getting the hell out of town. And I think this is true. The number one national security issue in the United States is our southern border. Okay, that's what I believe. It's our southern border. We have to figure this out. If we don't, populism will march through the United States in a bigger way than we can even think about. We have to get our act together around this. And it's all related, not just to climate, it's related to other things. But conflict is coming in a greater way than it has been to date. And it's going to be driven by things that are so obvious. It's so obvious, okay? You can't have super hot days increasing like a hockey stick. You can't have oceans today. Just look at what's going on in oceans. It's so off the chart now. If you talk to climate science, it's hard to imagine it. It's not possible. Every graph is saying it's supposed to do this. It's way above. If you're into standard deviations, it's 2.5 standard deviations away from what it's supposed to be. Okay, anyway, that's what I think. So I think we need to really get our act together around this, and we haven't. Even though there's some good news. There's some good news. solar prices down, wind prices down, electricity prices down, world understanding the problem more. There's some really good news. I'm not trying to ignore that, but I do think that, and I'd be interested in your view. Does conflict increase or not? Okay, over to you. Enough of me. Okay, so Fred Krupp is like 30 years running, arguably one of a couple of the most important US-based, but also global environmental groups. Fred, why do you do what you do? And then what are your top 3 priorities?
Well, thanks, Mark. I think it's fun to spend your time on things that matter. And early on, when I was growing up, I saw a lake, and the fish and the frogs all died because of the chemical spill upriver. And I kind of realized that what we have, the natural world, is incredibly fragile. And then when I was in college, I took a course in the environment, and there was a professor who said something that might resonate in this room, which is that these problems are solvable if people would just stop yelling at each other and talk to each other. So he was really calling for diplomacy, I guess, and understanding and reason, and that appealed to me. So the idea of spending, one's time working on something that is important, and pursuing approach in environmental things that, at least in the United States, hadn't been tried enough. Not every problem can be solved this way. Sometimes you have to litigate, sue people, but it turns out a lot more things can be solved this way than there have been people trying this approach.
What would be your top 3?
Yeah, thanks. I'd say the top 3 are probably climate change, and climate change. But within climate change, I'm really interested in the things that can make the biggest difference the soonest. So one of those would be tropical forests, where around the world, especially in places like the several nations that have, part of the Amazon forest, same in tropical Africa, same in Indonesia, and other places too, tropical forests and even temperate forests, there is a lot of deforestation happening, which puts a tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere. I think there are ways to solve this, because those forests are actually serving a purpose for the planet. And it just makes sense, in my view, to give those countries incentives, payments, cash to protect their forests. And so forests would be right there at the top of my list. And another thing, as you know, Mark, that I'm quite passionate about is gases that are climate pollution but have ignored. And the biggest one of those is methane. So when we think about climate pollution, we think about carbon dioxide. But it turns out that in 2024, this year, all the fossil fuels we burn will put out a lot of carbon dioxide, and that will heat the planet in the next 10 years about the same amount as the methane that we put into the air for the next 10 years. Now, the carbon dioxide keeps on heating for 100 years, so we have to make the transition away from burning fossil fuels. We have to do that. But if we make the transition away from methane pollution, that actually will have a quicker, faster impact because it's more tractable, and there's so much impact over the next 10 years. So, you know, under climate as the top three, those would be what I see, and what a fellow named John Foley, head of Project Drawdown, sees as those two as the emergency brakes, like the cord that you pull to stop the runaway train.
Can you describe methane sat?
Yeah, so once we realized that methane was a big problem, we found out that nobody knew where it was coming from because it's invisible, it's colorless, it's odorless, unless you put a scent in it, as we do in our natural gas pipelines. And so we began spending millions of dollars to find out where it was coming from. And we used handheld infrared cameras called a flare camera. We flew planes over oil wells, over 10,000 oil wells. We used drones, and eventually we spent $15–20 million doing this, and we got thousands, tens of thousands of measurements. That was great, but they were only of one point in time. And so on our team is we're blessed to have a chief scientist named Steve Hamburg, and as he was talking to the researchers that were doing these spot measurements, one of them named Steve Wolfsey, who's a professor at Harvard, the two of them were thinking, you know, there's a much more cost-effective way to do this. We can do it from space. And they thought, while it would cost millions, at the time they told me it would cost 50 million. We now know it ended up costing 88 million, but that it would be actually, although that's a big price tag, it would be much more cost effective to have one satellite that could look at the whole world with precision of 2 parts per billion, and big areas, and we could quantify how much methane, the volume of methane coming out from the oil and gas industry everywhere. And so Steve, one of the two Steves, called me up, Steve Hamburg, and said, we think we can do this. I said, if you can show me that you can do that, you know, let's do it. And so on March 4th, just a couple of months ago, out in California, we became the first nonprofit organization on the planet to launch our own satellite into space. And yesterday I got the news that the commissioning of the satellite is nearly done. It turns out it's more complicated to turn on all the different things in a satellite than just flipping a light switch. And as soon as later this week or the beginning of next week, we will begin to get the first readings of how much methane pollution there is around the world. And that's important because the estimates that we have, the guesses that we have, the reports that US companies were making to EPA were just a fraction of the total. So getting real data won't be the whole answer, but it will help.
So the United States spends about, it depends on how you measure it, $800 billion on defense, $800 billion a year. Okay. We have a whole fleet of satellites. We have no measurement of methane. Methane equals carbon, equals the amount of methane for the next 10 years. And 10 years from now, we'll have better technology to deal with stuff than we have today. So the point is to lay the problem as much as possible, because technology hopefully provides us better capacity to deal with the problem. Does that make any sense? Okay, Fred had to raise $88 million to launch a satellite to measure methane, because no one on the planet measured methane. But methane equals the amount of carbon produced globally. Does that make any sense? Doesn't make any sense, okay? And it's probable that the methane is being completely mismeasured. It's highly likely that there's a lot more methane being released. Imagine you run all the natural gas lines of Russia. How many leaks do you think there are in that system? Okay, over Texas, we know in the Permian, there's a lot more leakage than we thought, right? Is that true?
Yeah, we measured 60% more leakage than we thought. And a lot of these leaks turn out to be small. The sort of leak that's not that big, you can't see it. There are existing methane satellites that were in the air before methane sat. The European Union got together and the European Space Agency put into place TROPOMI, which is a great thing. And TROPOMI is able to find the big leaks, which we really need to close. And we have done joint papers with the scientists from TROPOMI. But it turns out in the Permian and in every other oil basin we've looked at, the large majority of the volume of leaks are these leaks that are leaking a little bit 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And MethaneSat will be the first and only satellite that actually can see them. These emissions are mostly invisible to every other satellite.
The only bad thing about MethaneSat is that they're working with Harvard. Okay, that's the only really terrible thing. Okay, who's from Africa in the room? Are there any diplomats from Africa here today? Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. Okay, so Africa. I want to go back to forests just for a second, and I'm not sure which countries you all are from. Which countries are you from? Egypt. Kenya. Great. President Ruto. Great. Who is the third person? Yes. South Africa. Great. Okay, so 3 important, every country is important, but super important countries on the continent. If you look on Google right now and say, how much does Africa release? How much carbon does Africa contribute to the world? The answer would be about 3.5%. Okay, 3.5%. And so therefore the world says, Africa is really not the problem. Okay, even the Africans say, we're not the problem. That's true, but, okay, that's true, but if you factor in deforestation, the amount of deforestation currently taking place, at least McKinsey would say, so I'm quoting them, is closer to 9%. The net number is closer to 9% because the amount of deforestation in the Congo is so overwhelming, primarily in the Congo, is so overwhelming that on a net basis, Africa produces as much net GHG, greenhouse gases, as almost as much as all of Europe. Okay, we have to get our act together around how we think about things like, would you spend $88 million to measure methane? Thank God for Europeans, actually, we're doing it. But would you do it? Yes, you should do that, okay? Would you understand how much is deforestation causing? Because just think about it, if I destroy a big tree or a massive amount of trees, the carbon is gone. Like that carbon is going to be out, right? So your net, you want to look at both emissions and deforestation together.
And I think, Mark, kudos to the president of Kenya, who has been a real leader on this, recognizing decarbonization is a problem and working to develop a carbon market system that would help give financial payments to countries that protect their forests. It helps to have a president who is also an expert in economics.
We have 20 minutes. I guess, are we going till 1?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have 20 minutes, so it's over to you now. So what do you want to talk about? Maybe we'll get 3 topics from the team and then we'll go for it. Yes, go ahead. Are you raising your hand? Go right ahead. And then this table, we'll get 4.
Okay.
Fred's good at
Thank you
remembering.
for the insightful discussion. I have actually questions.
Just say who you are and what country.
Eva from Poland, from Permanent Mission of Poland. How do you believe, because we should touch upon a conflict a little bit, how do you believe the environmental degradation contributes to conflict around the world? And on that note also, what role do you see natural resources playing in exacerbating or resolving conflict? Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Phillips. I'm from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My question is, how do we...
Your name again?
Sorry, Lawrence Phillips.
Lawrence.
Yeah. My question is, how do we balance the need for a rapid energy transition with the discomfort that many states are feeling with asymmetric dependence on certain states for either critical minerals or the technology itself, like solar panels, batteries, etc., which seems to be causing a break on things?
Yes, next, go right ahead.
Hello, thank you. Matthias from the Mission of Italy to the UN here in New York. Since we're trying to create bridges between the private sector and diplomacy, that's the point of this conversation, let me make an analogy. So the current international architecture is based on the post-Second World War balance of powers. Okay, there's a lot of discussion on trying to reform this architecture, and that's our job. All right. Since you're coming from the private sector, I think we can say, and it's a pretty correct analysis, that capitalism is based on fossil fuel, and this is still the main source of energy for the vast majority of countries. You, in your job, in your daily activities, are you trying to convince the private sector, financial sector, that the transition is can be based on market-based solutions? Is there a transition that is actually profitable directly for the businesses, let alone, let's say, climate change and environmental aspect of the final goal of reducing emissions for the sake of the planet? Is capitalism possible on the basis of a full transition away from fossil fuels? And if yes, how can we get there as fast as possible? Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, last one. One more? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm a counselor and the deputy military advisor from China Mission to UN. I think my question could be divided into three parts. The first, what do you think of the influence of the Ukraine situation to the change of global climate? And what are the major pragmatic approaches that the international community could take to enhance the present situation, considering the participation of China? And the third one is, what do you think of the impact of the major change of global supply chain to the developing trend of global climate change? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll come back to you in 1 minute, okay? Fred, why don't you take the first one, which is the environmental conflict question?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think Mark touched on it earlier that, climate migration is, was something 20 years ago was a theory, but now we see it. We see people leaving their homes, being forced to leave their homes because their crops can no longer grow because of the heat or because of the absence of enough water to irrigate their crops. So, or just physically, the heat is intolerable. So I don't think there's any question that, migration between countries is exacerbating tensions and conflicts. The world is not always a welcoming place as more and more people want to move. But the second part of your question is, how are natural resources exacerbating the problem, or could be part of the solution, if I heard you right? And it's the absence of, it's the change in rainfalls, the depletion of groundwater that can exacerbate the conflict. But also, as we talked about earlier, one huge natural resource is biodiversity in these forests. And it turns out, if we set up a rational system a market-based system where we're looking to solve this problem in the least expensive way, one of the least expensive ways to do that would be to give payments to Brazil or Ecuador or Indonesia if they can demonstrate that they actually have protected forest. And so there's something called Project LEAF, which the Norwegian government, the UK government, the US government have all been part of, which has a very rigorous standard that only compensates countries that have performed. And after they perform by protecting forests, then they get money. So the expansion of a concept like that can be a way natural resources can contribute to the solution.
So there are a lot of other questions here. Maybe I'll take a quick run and then you jump in. Okay. Okay. So, and one thing about this conflict thing, you all know more about conflict than I do, or we do. But to me, it's like, okay, Syria, this classic example, Syria, 1 million people move to Europe. Angela Merkel more or less loses her mandate. The most powerful person in Europe loses her mandate on 1 million people moving. That is nothing, 1 million people. We're just going to blow right through these numbers. I think the United States, the #1 issue Joe Biden, other being 82 years old, may lose for is the border. Okay, that's like it. This is happening. It's not theoretical. It's happening. So, okay, so on the decarbonization, this word decarbonization or transition, energy transition, how much of an energy transition are we currently having? How would you characterize it? Right? So CO2 this year, greenhouse gases this year will be higher than any time in human history. Okay? There is no transition going on. Transition implies this, okay? It doesn't mean that we're not making great progress. China, for example, is producing more green this year than the rest of the world combined, more renewables in China than the rest of the world combined. So, and the US is, a lot of people are doing good work. It's just you have to be careful of this word transition, because it's not normally what you would say a transition is happening, but we're actually increasing carbon when we have to get to zero carbon. Okay, so let's see, your comment, Lawrence, was around critical minerals, right? Is that right? Yeah, dependence on critical minerals. That's got to be true. We're too dependent on China. There's no doubt about that, okay? Africa is currently being used as a quarry for the rest of the world, right? We're quarrying minerals from Africa, shipping them other places, processing them, and then creating batteries and other things, and shipping them back. If China controls 90+% of that, that's not good for anybody. That increases the probability of conflict. I think that's obvious, right? It's a little bit of a math problem. That doesn't mean that China is to blame for that, but other countries have to get their act together if they want to have a distributed system that increases the probability conflict does not arise. On the World War II, post-World War II, et cetera, and capitalism, about 80% of all energy in the world today, how many barrels of oil do we eat a day? We eat about 103 million barrels in the world a day. But if you take a barrel and you say everything equals a barrel, all coal, any type of energy, nuclear, coal, anything, hydro, that we eat about 325 million barrels. Okay, so just think about that. 100 of fossil fuel, oil, natural gas. Now I want to flip it to everything else, 325 million barrels a day. Of that 325, 80% is fossil fuel today. That includes coal. Where is that number going? Do you think that 325 is going up? By the way, one thing I would ask diplomats to do, you're so good at so many things, don't be afraid of math. Don't be afraid of math. Okay, it's not that complicated. It's 8th grade algebra. Okay, is the number going up or not? Is 325 going to be higher by 2050 or lower? The amount of energy the world uses, higher or lower? Higher. Okay, how much higher? How much? 3 times higher. That would be a lot of growth. That would be, so if you double it, it would be 3% growth a year, okay? For 25 years. Take 23% times to the 25th power. That's as complicated as this gets, equals 2. Okay, so that would be a double. So I don't think it's going to be 3 times as much unless AI and other things, blah, blah, blah. Okay, you could argue that. But even if it's 2% growth, because the world economy grows 3.5% over the next 25 years, even if it's 2%, it's 1.6 times. So you go from 325 to 512 million barrels. There's a debate around this, but just bear with me for one more second. That just means that you've increased it by 325 to, we'll round up to 525, 200 million more barrels a day, okay? That has to be green. We have to start with making sure everything new is green. That's not what's happening, right? That's not what's happening. China's doing a great job of producing a lot more coal, burning a lot more coal. India, a lot more coal. Indonesia, a lot more coal. The United States eats as much coal as Vietnam, Indonesia, and South Africa combined today. Even though we've taken ours down, we eat so much energy here. We're just not up for the task, really. So I just think we need to think about what's the implication of it. That's a long-winded way of critical minerals, but there you go. Capitalism, yeah, our work on private sector in the funds is meant to be, so let's say we have $200 million fund, or 250, let's use a 250 fund. Where does the money come from? 25% of the 250, $62.5 million comes from rich people. They're the junior capital. And then 75% comes from governments and Microsoft. People like Microsoft might be participant. But it's mostly the DFC in the United States, BII. BII does a great job, and the Brits. Norfund, if you're from Norway, Asian Development Bank, IFC, all those parties provide the senior capital. Our goal is to do a good job with this capital and then have the private sector. Let's say you do something, it's $200 million investment, of which you need 5% of the money, $10 million up front. That's what we provide. And then the private sector comes in and does the rest of it. So we de-risk the project and try to get the private sector to do it, and then try to get the private sector next time to do it themselves. That's the simple concept. Do you want to take the Ukraine pragmatic solutions
Sure.
with China
Yeah.
and supply chains?
So I'll do that. Maybe we'll have time for a couple more questions before we close. So let me do this quick. I think on Ukraine, it is really inspired in many places, but particularly in Europe, for much accelerated efforts on energy efficiency, on solar, on wind, and heat pumps to heat homes instead of using fossil fuel sources. So I think that has been a big effect of Ukraine, not the only one, but the one that comes to mind. On cooperation, I think we know a lot. We've just talked about the fact that critical minerals, not only mining, but also processing, is heavily dependent on China. At the same time, when Chinese companies make electric cars, they're heavily dependent on United States-made chips. And so I think this is an area where there needs to be diplomacy to figure out how do we keep all the production going everywhere. It's in a way that accommodates all the economic interests of the different parties. I can't solve that for you here in a second on stage, but that's perfect subject for diplomacy. The last thing I would say on this, and then maybe we have time for a couple more questions, is one example of the world cooperating was an agreement that was reached on March 5th or 7th in Montreal, 2020, just as the pandemic was spreading around the world. And that agreement was from many of the countries of the world, to try something new in aviation. As people get wealthier, if people have disposable income, one of the things they want is to see the world. And that means we're very likely to have more airline miles traveled, whether that's a desirable thing or not from the climate's perspective. So the diplomats negotiated under the auspices in International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, something called CORSIA, which basically says, committed the airlines to keeping emissions flat, even as there was growth. So it went through a pilot phase, and now it's in a trial phase. And then the real system or bigger system starts in 2027. What does that mean? Is that it means that the airlines have incentives as passenger miles increase to change their planes so they're more fuel efficient. That's why you see at the end of the wings, the wingtips up. That's why when you're in a plane now and you're taxiing around an airport, usually one engine is working, not every engine. But beyond changing the planes to use sustainable aviation fuel, it's got to be really sustainable. There's a whole conversation there. And then the third thing is the airlines are allowed to buy, say, these tropical forest credits to help Brazil preserve or Indonesia preserve its rainforest if the countries set up a good system to make sure that those credits are real. That is an example of the way the world can cooperate to accommodate the need for more travel, incentivize innovation in planes and in fuels, and route money that's going to be spent to where you get the most carbon reductions per dollar spent. Do we have time for a couple more?
Yeah.
Yes. Just speak right up and I'll repeat while we wait for the mic. Do you have an extra mic here?
Hi, quick question here. Michelle Kingle, USAID West Africa. I think this was touched on before, but what would you say are the most effective ways to encourage investment in green technologies that can help to mitigate various environmental conflicts? And how do you make the case to, let's say, development banks and agencies who are oftentimes risk adverse, especially during the initial stages of investment?
Hello? Yeah. Can we start from the Netherlands mission? First of all, thank you for your important insights. I had a question about the role of the private sector when it comes to climate adaptation, specifically because we've been talking a lot about the energy transition, about mitigation, but the global warming is happening. It's going to be 1.5 degrees or possibly more if we don't stick to our emission targets, of course. And the business case for climate adaptation is relatively limited. Also, when you look at financial markets, there's been less development on that front as well, or at least, especially in the global south where it's needed the most, right? So what kind of incentive structure can we as policymakers provide for the private sector to make sure that there is more business case, if any? And how can we work together with the private sector to really also improve our game when it comes to climate adaptation?
Take this question.
Yeah, so actually very much in line with what the colleague said. My name is Elena. I'm from UN Secretariat. So wanted to also to build on that. What can we do? I mean, we're here from governments, multilateral institutions, private sector, NGOs, like almost everyone is in the room, right? How can we enhance those partnerships, especially very egoistically looking from the UN, private and NGO perspective? And also if you have just an inspiring example of where this partnership has really been, shown that we can. Thanks.
Mark, a lot of private sector here, so I'm over to you.
All right, you have the UN one, all right? On the green technologies, so using green technologies for conflict, I think there are existing technologies that would help mitigate conflict, I think. So for example, water, anything around water, desalinization, water desalinization, clean water, water availability. I really think this is a really crucial energy access, of course, but sanitation and water. I could say more about that, but I'll stick with that. Development banks. There's a lot of good work going on in development banks. I think they're super important. I'm on Ajay Banga's private sector investment lab, it's called. There are 15 CEOs. Most of them run really big companies. I run a really tiny company. And I think Ajay, the new head of the World Bank, is really aligned with the other DFIs and MDBs, the Asian Development Bank, et cetera, to push innovation. They're trying to push innovation. They're like everybody, it's hard. It's hard to change culture, hard to change mandate. They're a AAA bank. AAA banks don't like to take risk, right? So it's not just their challenge, it's the challenge of the people who own those banks. Adaptation in the private sector. If you go down the FDR Drive, many of you know New York well, go down the FDR Drive, go down toward Wall Street, look to the left if you're driving downtown, and you'll see a very large, by New York standards, large project. Okay, so it runs 1.25 miles, and it's taking the East River, it's taking pandemic money, Hurricane Sandy money. Hurricane Sandy took place about 10 years ago, and building up a new park, okay? New park, 13 feet above sea level. If you go down the river over here, we're about 4.5 feet above sea level. So 13 feet above sea level. It runs 1.2-ish miles. It costs $1.6 billion. Okay, that's adaptation. Okay, how many miles does the New York City have? Because we have all these nooks and crannies. 500 miles. Okay, 500 miles. We should protect five. Now, you could argue we won't have to do that. We could cut off certain canals, et cetera. It won't be 500 miles. But we have to figure out a way to protect places. I would not look to the private sector for that. Who is the private sector actor on adaptation? Who asked that question? Somebody did. What was your name again? Kavish. Okay, so FMO does a great job, by the way, in the Netherlands. It's just think about it. What is the return on invested capital of that $1.6 billion? Well, it could be great if you protect a bunch of buildings, but is the private sector going to pay for that? I don't think so. Okay. Governments need to get their act together and figure out a way how to protect key assets. That's where it's going, you know? And back to the Ukraine, just for 1 second. There's so many profound things in the Ukraine. Profound sadness, misery, death, destruction. Okay. On another level, the Ukraine and many other things take our eye off of this issue. Consistently take our eye off the issue. The United States spends about $2 trillion per year more than it has right now. $2 trillion. Okay. Will the world allow us to do that for the next 50 years? I doubt it. Okay. That's not the way markets work. So we have to figure out, how do we focus our precious capital and your precious time on the most important things? Conflict avoidance, you never get credit. Diplomats never get credit for conflict avoidance. It's only when the world blows up that the world pays attention, arguably. But what you're doing is so important. If you can decline the probability of a conflict or eliminate it, this is hugely valuable, because the world has super major things to focus on. Climate's just one of them. Personally, I think it's the number one, but you can debate that. So anyway, over to you.
Yeah, I'll do this really quick because I know we are out of time. But I think in terms of, I agree with what you said, Mark, that on resilience, unfortunately, it's going to be mostly governments. Having said that, I think on reducing emissions, that we can figure out policies, international policies, UN-based policies that make a big difference. And the ones that are my favorite are the ones that I've mentioned on tropical forests, something called Project Leaf, which is a collaboration of many individual countries and businesses. Project Leaf is selling these tropical forest tons now. It is not a market price. It's $10 a ton. But at $10 a ton, and if you think the $7 trillion oil and gas industry, if you just took $50 billion of that, a relatively small percentage, tiny, that could take care of 5 gigatons of carbon. That's a really big deal. So That's one. And then Corsia is an example of a market-based system which can leverage private money. All of these things really, in the Paris Agreement, there's something called Article 6, which we've been very slow to negotiate and bring to ground. But bringing to ground Article 6 could be a way to leverage vast amount of private money, which to really make the transition that Mark pointed out we're not yet really making, it's going to require trillions of dollars. Governments don't have they have to have the money for resilience, but they don't have the money for the transition. So these international policies could be the key.
So I have three quick comments. One, governments do have the money. This is the only thing I would disagree with Fred on. The United States spent $6 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our return on invested capital was negative a zillion human lives and $1 zillion, okay? 6 trillion we spent. The world spent $20 trillion on COVID. $20 trillion, okay? We have to get our act together around what is the priority. If we don't spend it now, which governments definitely have the money, the only issue is whether they have the will and the political capability. That's where you guys come in. Just two last comments on the private sector thing. If you go to Nigeria or Kenya or even the United States, we burn a lot of diesel, okay? But if you go to Nigeria, it's about 4 gigawatts on grid. There's about 50 gigawatts diesel. That diesel costs 40 cents a kilowatt hour, 40 cents. 40 cents a kilowatt, $40 a kilowatt hour, excuse me. That is relative to solar. Solar is about 10 cents. Okay. How come we have 50 gigawatts of diesel in Nigeria? It's not capitalism. It's partnerships, it's corruption, it's all sorts of bad action. Okay. There's no reason to be spending that money on diesel in a sunny place. It's really nuts. It's dollars. You're spending hard currency on diesel imports. That's true all over the planet. We do stupid things like that. So it's kind of capitalism, but it's corrupt. It's backwards capitalism. It's not just corruption, it's other things. It's the incumbent. The incumbent has great power. Great power. It's hard to get the new stuff going. Okay. Anyway.
Thank you.
Talking. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.